The crown of England was never meant for a man who lived in the shadows of the distant east. Yet there he stood, watching the gray fog roll over the Ouse River like a funeral shroud. Harald Hardrada, a name whispered in fear from the frozen fjords of Norway to the gilded, blood-stained halls of Constantinople, had finally come to claim what he believed was his by right of iron. But as the cold wind bit through his cloak, a silent warning echoed in the stillness of the morning. History was shifting beneath his boots, and the ground he stood upon was preparing to swallow the legacy of the North forever. This was not just a quest for a throne. It was the final, frantic heartbeat of an era that had redefined the world through fire and steel. The year was 1066, a time when the sky itself seemed to portend the end of things. A comet had cut through the darkness months earlier, a jagged scar of light that left the common folk trembling and the powerful looking toward the horizon with narrowed, hungry eyes. In England, the death of Edward the Confessor had left a vacuum, a hollow space in the center of the world that three men intended to fill with their own shadows. To the south, William of Normandy gathered a fleet built on the promise of conquest. In London, Harold Godwinson had already grasped the scepter, his knuckles white with the strain of holding a kingdom together. But from the north came the most terrifying prospect of all, the Last Viking. Harold was no mere raider looking for silver and slaves. He was a seasoned commander of the Varangian Guard, a man who had survived the serpentine intrigues of the Byzantine Empire and amassed a fortune in gold that could buy entire kingdoms. He was a giant, both in stature and in legend, a man who had seen the sun rise over the deserts of the Levant and the snows of Russia. When his 300 ships appeared on the English coast, they looked like a forest of masts emerging from the mist, carrying thousands of seasoned warriors who knew only the law of the blade and the brotherhood of the shield. This invasion was a calculated gamble, fueled by the poisonous whispers of a disgruntled brother. Tostig Godwinson, the exiled Earl of Northumbria, had sought out the Norwegian king, weaving a web of promises and betrayal. Tostig painted a picture of an England divided, a land where the people would rise to support a true warrior over the usurper in London. It was a classic trap of ambition, and Harold, despite his decades of experience in the deadliest courts of the world, allowed himself to be lured by the prospect of one final, glorious conquest. He saw not a trap, but a destiny. The initial movements were deceptively easy, a slow-motion dance of dominance. The Vikings moved through the northern territories, leaving a trail of submission and smoldering ruins behind them. At the Battle of Fulford, they met the local northern earls in a confrontation that seemed to confirm Harold's superiority. The English lines crumbled under the weight of the Northmen's ferocity. The rivers were said to be blocked by the sheer number of those who had fallen, a grim bridge of the dead. When York, the great northern capital, opened its gates, it felt like the beginning of a new empire. The atmosphere in the Viking camp was one of triumph, a celebration of a victory that felt already won. They believed the English king, Harold Godwinson, was still hundreds of miles to the south, paralyzed by the threat of the Normans. It was this single assumption, this quiet moment of overconfidence, that sealed their fate. The morning of September 25th broke with an unusual warmth, the kind of heat that makes a man want to shed his burdens. The Viking army, resting near the crossing at Stamford Bridge, felt so secure that many had left their heavy mail shirts and protective gear back at the ships. They were scattered across the fields, enjoying the sun, waiting for the hostages and tribute promised by the people of York. The air was filled with the sounds of laughter and the clinking of coins, not the preparation for a fight. They were warriors at rest, oblivious to the fact that the earth was vibrating with the approach of an unseen storm. On the horizon, a cloud of dust began to rise. At first, the Vikings dismissed it as more locals arriving to pay homage, or perhaps Tostig's scouts returning with news. Then the sun hit the dust, and the horizon didn't just turn gray, it turned silver. The silver was the reflection of thousands of spearheads and polished helmets. Harold Godwinson had done the impossible. He had marched his army over 180 miles in just 4 days, a feat of endurance that defied the logic of the time. The English were not supposed to be there. They were supposed to be a ghost story, a distant concern. The realization hit the Viking camp like a physical blow. The laughter died in their throats, replaced by the frantic shouting of orders and the clatter of weapons. Without their armor, caught on the wrong side of the river with their forces divided, the invaders were suddenly the prey. Harald Hardrada, the giant of the north, stood amidst the chaos, his mind racing to form a line of defense. He sent messengers on horseback, racing back to the ships for reinforcements. But he knew the distance was too great and the sun was too high. Time, the one thing he had always been able to manipulate, had finally run out. The bridge itself became a bottleneck of tension and desperate struggle. Legend tells of a single unnamed Norse warrior who stood upon the narrow wooden planks, holding back the entire English vanguard. He was a shadow of the old world, a figure of immense strength who refused to yield, his axe swinging in great bloody arcs.
Come on, then.
For a time, the English march was halted by this lone obstacle, a testament to the individual prowess that had made the Vikings the terror of Europe for 3 centuries. But the era of the lone hero was ending. Under the cover of the bridge, an English soldier navigated the freezing water in a wooden tub, thrusting a long spear through the gaps in the timber. The defender fell, the bridge was cleared, and the floodgates of history opened. On the other side of the river, Hardrada had finally managed to form a shield wall, the classic triangular formation known as the boar's snout. The Vikings stood shoulder to shoulder, their circular shields overlapping, a wall of wood and determination. But they were fighting against the weight of exhaustion and the lack of their protective iron. The English army, fresh with the momentum of their surprise arrival and the fury of defending their home, crashed into the wall again and again. The sound was a rhythmic, sickening thud of wood against wood, a grim percussion that echoed across the fields of Yorkshire. Hardrada himself was in the thick of it, his height making him a clear target, his sword a blur as he fought with the ferocity of a man who knew his legend was on the line. The conflict was not just between 2 armies, but between 2 incompatible worlds.
Your Majesty,
Godwinson's England was trying to stabilize, to become a centralized state of laws and borders, while Hardrada represented the old ways of expansion through sheer force and wandering ambition. As the hours passed, the heat of the day and the intensity of the struggle took a brutal toll. The Viking line, usually unbreakable, began to fray at the edges as men collapsed from heat stroke and blood loss. Hardrada, seeking to inspire his men through one final act of defiance, surged forward, abandoning the safety of the shield wall. It was a move of pure instinct, the kind that had saved him in the deserts and the palaces of the East. But here, in a damp field in northern England, his luck finally evaporated. An arrow, unguided by anything but the cold hand of fate, found its mark in his throat. With the fall of the Norwegian king, the heart of the Viking resistance stopped beating. Tostig Godwinson tried to rally the remaining men, but the arrival of the Viking reinforcements from the ships, men who were already exhausted from running miles in the midday heat, only added more bodies to the slaughter without changing the outcome. By the time the sun began to set, casting long, bloody shadows across the field, the silence was absolute. The great Viking army, which had arrived in 300 ships with the intent to crown a king, would need only 24 to carry the survivors back to Norway. The age of the Sea Kings, which had begun with the raid on Lindisfarne nearly 300 years earlier, had reached its final, silent conclusion at an obscure river crossing. But for Harald Godwinson, the victory was hollow. As he stood among the thousands of dead, the air thick with the smell of iron and decay, he received word from the south. The winds had changed. William of Normandy had landed at Pevensey. The tragedy of Stamford Bridge is often overshadowed by what happened just 19 days later at Hastings. But the two events are inseparable. History remembers Godwinson as the king who lost to the Normans, but it rarely dwells on the psychological and physical cost of his triumph over Hardrada. His army was depleted, his best housecarls were buried in the northern soil, and the momentum he had gained was spent in a desperate struggle against the ghost of the Viking past. If the Vikings had not landed, if Hardrada had not forced that brutal, record-breaking march to the north, the map of the modern world might look entirely different. The last Viking didn't just lose his life. He inadvertently paved the way for the Norman Conquest that would reshape Western civilization, its language, and its laws. The ambition of one man in Norway triggered a sequence of events that would strip the Anglo-Saxon elite of their power forever. It is a narrative of interconnected fates, where the victory of the morning becomes the seed of the defeat in the evening. In the aftermath, the English countryside returned to a state of uneasy peace, but the air felt thinner, the world smaller. The dread that had characterized the Viking Age, the constant watching of the horizon for dragon-headed ships, slowly began to fade from the collective memory of Europe. The Northmen would eventually become kings of established realms, traders of far-flung goods, and builders of cathedrals. But they would never again move as a singular existential threat to the continent. Harald Hardrada's ambition was the final flare of a dying sun, a brilliant and terrifying light that vanished into the darkness of the Middle Ages. Walking through the fields near Stamford today, there is little to suggest that the fate of a kingdom was decided here. The river flows quietly, and the bridge has been replaced many times over. Yet, for those who know the story, there is a lingering heaviness in the atmosphere. It is the weight of 1,000 stories ending at once. It is the silence of a culture that lived by the sword and eventually found its limit against a foe that refused to stay beaten. The dark thriller of the Viking Age didn't end with a whimper, but with a collision of two giants, leaving only one standing to face the next inevitable storm. The gamble of Harald Hardrada serves as a timeless reminder of the fragility of power. He was a man who had conquered every obstacle, survived every betrayal, and amassed every treasure, only to be undone by a 4-day march and a lack of protective iron. His story is a testament to the fact that no matter how great the legend, the tide of time eventually turns against everyone. As the last of the Viking ships disappeared into the North Sea mist, they carried with them the end of an era that would never be seen again. The world had moved on, leaving the giants of the past to become the ghosts of the soil. The shadows at Stamford Bridge are long, stretching back through the centuries to remind us that every empire has its sunset. The conflict between the two haralds was more than a battle. It was a pivot point for humanity. The risk was absolute, the cost was total, and the result was the birth of a new England and the death of the Old North. In the quiet of the Yorkshire evening, if one listens closely, the echoes of the shield wall still seem to vibrate in the air, a final ghostly resonance of the day the Viking world stood still and then vanished into the pages of a dark and bloody history. There is a certain irony in the way the names are remembered. We speak of the victors and the losers, but we often forget that both men at Stamford Bridge were chasing a ghost. The crown they fought over was already being claimed by another, far to the south. Their struggle, as intense and horrific as it was, served only to weaken the winner for his own eventual downfall. The dark thriller of 1066 is a story of 3 men, 2 battles, and 1 crown. But the ultimate winner was the passage of time itself. As the years turned into centuries, the details of the fight blurred into folklore. The lone man on the bridge became a mythic figure, and Harald Hardrada became a symbol of a lost world. But the reality was much grimmer. It was a day of miscalculation and the brutal reality of warfare. It was the moment the North realized that the world was no longer a place that could be taken by a single man with a great sword and a bold heart. The systems of the world were becoming more complex, the distances shorter, and the risks higher. The end of the Viking Age was the beginning of the medieval state, a shift from the era of heroes to the era of administrations. The legacy of that day remains etched in the DNA of the Western world. We are living in the shadow of the events that transpired on that warm September morning. The language we speak, the laws we follow, and the borders of our nations were all influenced by the fact that Harald Hardrada fell and Harold Godwinson marched. It is a reminder that history is not a straight line, but a series of collisions, often decided by the smallest of margins. A missing coat of mail, a hidden soldier in a tub, or a single arrow in the throat. The thrill of the story lies in how close it all came to being different. In the final analysis, the story of the Last Viking is not just a tale of war, but a psychological study of the limits of human ambition. Hardrada had everything, yet he risked it all for a title he didn't need. He was a man who couldn't stop, a warrior who had to keep moving until there was nowhere left to go but into the ground. His end at Stamford Bridge was perhaps the only way his story could have truly concluded. In a storm of iron, on a foreign field, at the very moment he thought he had won. The darkness of the thriller lies in that realization, that even the greatest of us are often the architects of our own quiet disappearance.